Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this special session dealing with disaster risk management standards for business and citizens. Given that we have a fairly tight schedule, what we've decided to do is start. I'm sure we'll have people wander in as the session progresses, but those of you that have turned up on time, we figure we want to tap into your knowledge and experience as best we can. The session that we're dealing with here is looking very much at regulations and standards and how can they assist us in the management of disaster risk. Now, the obvious one is, for example, building standards dealing with earthquakes. Where we've got good standards, society is able to handle earthquakes quite well. If we look at the Christchurch earthquake in New Zealand a couple of years ago, it was fascinating to look at how buildings survived. Those that had been around for a long time and had never been covered by any modern standards, they were the ones that crumbled. And then we looked at the ones that were badly damaged through to the ones that were virtually untouched, and you could see the iterations of standards dealing with buildings. But the same can apply with standards even as far as the management of risk and the management of counter-disaster work. At the ISO level, we have two ISO committees, ISO 223, Societal Security, which is essentially dealing with the development of standards to address natural disasters and the responses to natural disasters through to business continuity and societal continuity aspects. So again, they're looking at providing a consensus document to start to bring a global perspective, a global language to how we manage risk in the event of disasters. Societal security, I know, is a terrible name, but nobody could quite agree. It was a committee, if we go back many years, was called the old Civil Defence Committee. So it's looking, though, very much at how do we respond to disasters, how do we respond to man-made attacks that require a societal response to be able to bring society back to where it was before the event. We've also got the ISO 262, which is the Risk Management Committee, which I chair, and that's looking at the management of risk as a management discipline. It's not the insurable loss type risks, but it really is the management of risk using a risk management process. And the standard that we've produced is ISO 31000, which looks at setting some principles, providing how you implant risk, the management of risk into your management system, and then provide you with the risk management process to gather information that then feeds into the management system so that we are able to make better decisions. And the thing that I always point out is that the greatest risk is people's decision making, because every time I make a decision to do or not to do something, I create the risk of, have I made the right decision and can I manage it to a successful outcome? And that doesn't matter whether it's to do with disaster preparedness or reaction to a disaster. If I haven't prepared and addressed the potential risks, how do we ensure that society is best protected by the resources that we provide to deal with disasters and their management? And that's why increasingly we're finding people talking about disaster management. It's no longer a case of let's respond, but let's look at how we can manage the response to disasters. And this, I would suggest, is where the management of risk becomes important, because disasters by their very nature create a whole lot of unexpected events that will impact on your best laid plans. So that's the real sense behind this session today. We've got an interesting group of experts to share their experience on the types of regulatory frameworks, the laws, the regulations, voluntary codes that are best suited for different types of issues related to disaster risk management. or actually what I would like to see, the management of disaster risk. And we're also looking at country experience, because quite obviously some countries, because of the regularity of disasters, unfortunately, have developed a strong practical process for dealing with them. Other societies, fortunately, disasters come along few and far between, but that creates a whole lot of quite different risks to that society, that the dangerous complacency sets in, and how do we actually trigger the memories so that we can effectively manage the risks when a disaster does occur. So you've got the two problems. The one where disasters are so regular that we all become really well practiced. But then do we have the time to stand back and look at, can we manage it better, through to those societies where disasters are few and far between? And then the danger then is, how well are we able to preserve the memory, the collective memory of the society, to ensure that we do manage those risks effectively, and that we have appropriate regulatory frameworks, because that's always the important thing, is that the legislation, the standards, all have to be designed to assist the society and its first and second responders to be able to deal with the disaster when it occurs. Each of our panellists, we've given them a couple of questions to address, and we've given them 5 minutes to do it in, so it's going to be fairly concise, and the pressure's been put on them. But then we want to open the majority of the session to you, the participants. What are some of your experiences? What are some of the things where you see a need for better regulation, better standards, better education of people on the existence of standards? And then at the end, each of the panellists will have a minute or so to present their key message to you that we would like they would like you to take away from today's session. So our panellists, starting down from my left here, is Mark Chandeli, the head of Nestlé Risk Management. Ms. Mette Lindahl Olsen, the head of Natural Hazards and Critical Infrastructure section of the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency. Mr. Gilles de Veres, the member of the European Court of Auditors, because auditors have a really important role in the management of risk, because it's to see, are the systems in place, and most importantly, are the information coming back up to decision makers, have they got rigour to them? And then we also have Ms. Arif Koskan from Turkey, who's on the INTOSAI working group on accountability for the audit of disaster-related aid. Again, a very important part of how we manage disasters is how we manage the aid that goes with it. And then finally we have Lorenzo Garcia from the United Nations Economic Committee for Europe. And the UNECE has done a lot of work on applying risk management to the development of regulatory responses across the European economies. So, just to set the stage, what we're looking at is what have we learned over 10 years of experience in looking at using risk and the management of risk within disasters and disaster preparedness. In Australia, we've been playing with a risk management standard now since 1995, and it has been utilised by our Disaster Management Authority, Emergency Management Australia, to produce a number of documents and policy directives based on emergency risk management. So it's applying the risk management process to how we respond to disasters, both in the respect of how we respond to the immediacy of the disaster, but probably most importantly, a lot of the work that they've been doing has been, how do we rebuild after a disaster? Because the policy in Australia was always, disaster occurs, and then the federal and state governments would come along and they would pour money in to put things back the way they were. So the inefficient bridges and the problem roads and a whole range of things that every time there was a flood or a cyclone would always be closed off, we put them back again so that in a year or two's time they could be washed away again, and then we'd replace them again. The policy now is to look at building bridges higher and stronger. We've had a case recently, 12 months ago now, where this magnificent bridge has been put over what most of the year is a dry gully. But for 1 or 2 months of the year during the monsoonal season, it cuts off probably about access to a quarter of Australia in the north because of low-level floods. So again, it's spending the money up front rather than continually spending it. And it's looking at how do you develop regulations, government policies, and indeed government legislation to enable this to occur, so that we're not overspending and we're not underspending, but we're trying to get it just right to put in facilities that will survive the 1 in 100 years, the 1 in 150 year type event, rather than something that is damaged every time there is an adverse weather event. As I said at the opening things, our friends across the Tasman in New Zealand have done a lot of work in applying the management of risk to earthquakes, because earthquakes are something that they live with day in and day out. And again, particularly looking at how do you put in buildings, how do you put in facilities that will be able to resist or at least survive better in the event of earthquakes. Now again, that's that very delicate balancing act that you're faced with because of the fact that we've got to make sure that we're not overspending. We're not building things to the point where they are so gold-plated that you really can't afford to keep on doing it. So the challenge I suggest when we're looking at coming up with standards, coming up with regulations, coming up with legislation, is how do we balance being proactive, providing a greater resilience, but without spending more money than we've got? Because I don't know of any country or any economy that is sitting around wondering what to spend money on. So the real challenge for us when it comes to disaster management is to look at how we can meet that balancing act of attaining the resilience without running out of money or gold plating it. So to start off the proceedings, Mr. De Vries, as I said, is a member of the INTO-SAI, and we've posed a couple of questions to him. One is that it's the first time that the INTO-SAI has participated in this forum, and can you present how it works, its relevance to the work of the national authorities' efforts to reduce disaster risk?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts and ideas with you and to learn from your suggestions. My name is Guy de Vries. I'm a member of the European Court of Auditors. I'm a former member of the Dutch government, and I chair an initiative of the World Organization of Supreme Audit Institutions called INTO-SAI to help Supreme Audit institutions contribute more to accountability in this crucial area. Victims want to know that their government is spending taxpayers' money efficiently and effectively so that the money reaches the victims. They want independent watchdogs to make sure that this happens. Similarly, taxpayers in donor countries want to be sure that humanitarian aid is spent effectively and efficiently. Accountability, therefore, is crucial. There are 4 main pillars of accountability. National parliaments can play a critical role, and it needs to be strengthened in this area. Sometimes courts can play a role. Civil society can play an incredibly important role. And auditors can inform both civil society and parliaments about the state of preparedness and effectiveness of the national government in the field of disaster management. I want to do 3 things. I want to point out what auditors have done and can do. I want to say something about the limits to their work and the challenges to be overcome, and I want to end with a proposal. First then, what do auditors actually do in the field of disaster risk reduction? Let me give you an example by the Supreme Audit Institution of India to illustrate what I mean. That audit institution has just published a major report about disaster preparedness in India. Here are some of its findings. In India, the National Disaster Response Fund was utilized for purposes other than those stated in the guidelines. The National Disaster Mitigation Fund still needs to be established. The National Database for Emergency Management, which had to be set up several years ago, is still to be operationalized. The satellite-based communication network is still not operational after more than 6 years of receipt of the communications equipment. The National Disaster Communication Network is still at the planning stage after several years of conceptualization. The National Executive Committee has not met since 2008. The National Plan for Disaster Management has not been formulated even 6 years after the adoption of the Act. A long list of major failings in the way India is preparing for disasters. That is not to criticize the Indian government because of the fun of it. It is to help public opinion and the Parliament in India understand the need to do better. But this is not the only example. My own institution has looked at the aid that Central America received in the late 90s after Hurricane Mitch and found that aid to be much too slow. The Auditor General of Sri Lanka has audited the aid that Sri Lanka received after the 2004 tsunami and found major cases of waste and corruption. Last year, the French Cour des Comptes audited disaster management in France, found millions in waste, and criticized local politicians for allowing buildings to be constructed in zones that were liable to be struck by disaster. In Tanzania, the Auditor General found that the authorities were not adequately preparing for floods. In Namibia, the Auditor General found shortcomings in the prevention and management of disasters. And the Auditor General of Canada published an audit criticizing Public Safety Canada, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, for a lack of leadership. Interestingly, several months after this hard-hitting report, the government responded by updating Canada's emergency standards. So these are some examples of what can be done. What does that mean in concrete terms? Well, for example, auditors can audit national compliance with the international standards. For example, compliance with the Hyogo framework. The Hyogo framework is still not sufficiently known in many national departments and in many national parliaments. Auditors can help to see how it's implemented. They can audit the implementation by national governments of low regret measures, such as early warning systems, risk communication practices, land use planning, enforcement of building codes, and ecosystem management. And crucially, they can audit if national ministries and agencies actually are acting joined up, if they cooperate across government in disaster risk reduction. Too often we find that little coordination exists between ministries responsible for disaster management, environment, agriculture, spatial planning, and development. The World Organization of Auditors is developing guidelines to national auditors to help them to carry out this work worldwide. We're working on standards in 4 areas. First, to audit disaster-related foreign aid better. Indonesia has led that work. Then, to audit disaster risk reduction globally. Turkey has led that work, and my colleague Arife Koskun will explain what has happened. Thirdly, we're looking at how to prevent fraud and corruption in this major area, unfortunately still too prevalent in major areas of humanitarian and other aid. And fourthly, we're looking at the role of geospatial information systems in helping audits become more effective. We're also working on a proposal to increase accountability for humanitarian aid worldwide. All these proposals will be adopted at the end of this year at the World Conference of Intosai in Beijing and then offered to Secretary Ban Ki-moon. So this is what can be done. But there are some major challenges and difficulties that auditors face, and for which I'd like to ask your attention. First, international organizations, including UNISDR, have been slow to recognize the potential of audit institutions to play a major role in this area. It's perhaps a bit of an overstatement, but just to focus the attention, perhaps the audit institutions are the Cinderella of disaster risk reduction. That needs to change because accountability needs to gain a higher profile. Secondly, Supreme Audit institutions are underused as a partner of civil society in dialogue about both the prevention policies of governments and their policies subsequent to disasters. We need to work on that dialogue. And thirdly, in many developing countries, but in even some developed countries, auditors simply need more training. Some of this work is highly technical, and you really need to know what you're talking about to be able to make a difference. The UN has to be much more proactive in providing leadership on training. My proposal is the following. UNISDR is now working on a new Hyogo framework post-2015. That's excellent. In the previous framework, accountability has not figured prominently. It's time that that changed. We need to work on much better disaster preparedness by governments, but we also need to help institutions to hold these governments to account. So my plea to UNISDR is to include the dimension of accountability much more dynamically, much more creatively, and much more concretely in the next strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that opening contribution. And as you mentioned, we now have your colleague, Ms. Arif Koskan, from the Turkish Court of Accounts. And if you would perhaps give us the experience in Turkey and carry on the discussion of the very vital role of auditors.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to avail myself of this opportunity to express my great pleasure for having the opportunity of addressing to such a distinguished audience. I think if I give you a little background information about our study in the field of disaster risk reduction, it will help you to understand my frame. Within the INTOSAI working group, Accountability for Audit of Disaster-Related Aid, we, as Turkish Court of Account, took responsibility for performing two tasks. I am entrusted with performing of this task in my office. One of them is to prepare the guidelines for Supreme Audit institutions. In this frame, we prepared the SAI 5510 Audit of Disaster Preparedness. That is still an exposure draft Mr. Dovries mentioned. It will officially have published in October 2013. Meanwhile, I want to state that the title of the SAI 5510 was changed as Audit of Disaster Risk Reduction, with the aim of bringing it into conformity with more common terminology in the field of disaster management and in accordance with its content. On what we focused in the SAI 5510. The SAI 5510 was prepared with a broad scope and in a manner that covers all important matters concerning the pre-disaster stage and includes almost all the issues covered in the Hyogo frame. Needless to say, it was prepared with audit perspective. And besides, the issue was handled with a broad perspective that would extend the vision beyond the existing one in the field of auditing disaster risk reduction. In this context, we focused on the issues such as specification of policy gaps and legal arrangements, assessment of governance structure based upon organization and coordination structure, evaluation of national strategies, national and local planning, usage and evaluation of management tools, such as geographical information system, early warnings, and GPRS, evaluation of training activities and public awareness campaign, assessment of financial structure, assessment of project and programs for making urban area resilient. As you noticed easily, In parallel with the international policy, paradigm shifting is tried to be reflected upon the ISAE 5510 auditing of disaster risk reduction. This frame also sets the scope of parallel coordinated audits conducted within the INTOSAI working group accountability and auditing disaster-related aid. Within the INTOSAI working group, we organize and lead the parallel audit with the aim of testing the ISAE 5510 and improving its content. The ISAE Supreme Audit institutions of Azerbaijan, Chile, India, Indonesia, Netherlands, Pakistan, Philippines, Romania, Ukraine, and Turkey participated and supported this joint initiative. In these 10 countries participated in the parallel coordinated audit, new disaster management acts which involve in issues concerning disaster risk reduction entered into force between the second half of 1990s and 2010. First of all, I should put emphasis on the fact that it is a positive reflection of change and new objectives in international policies concerning reducing the risk of and preparing for potential disasters. Of course, sufficiency of these laws is a separate issue. I can summarize the parallel audit results in a way that no multi-hazard and multi-stage approach, not compromising all aspects of disaster risk reduction, mostly focused on emergency phase. Inadequate framework for the responsibilities and roles of the institutions and the arrangements for coordination. Ill-defined relationship between national and local authorities. Insufficient arrangements not setting a facilitating framework for international and national assistance and participation of civil society. In addition to this, I can give more examples. For example, national strategies and plans in many countries, especially which have amended their disaster laws recently, national disaster strategies and plans have not been specified and prepared yet, while the content of those prepared is not sufficient. When you examine the national reports sent to UN ISDR, you will see that most countries prepared their national disaster plans. Unfortunately, according to our audit results, these plans do not have a broad scope and are mostly limited with emergency preparedness. Indeed, these are the explicit reasons. When we track back the underlying reasons for these problems, we will very likely to find the narrow scope of accountability and insufficient content for public awareness. In this framework, we have to redescribe the accountability framework at national and international level. We have to redescribe the accountability, and depending on this new and larger framework, everything from policy and governance structure to implementation, even to audit, should be redesigned. Besides, public awareness should be extended in a manner that covers all aspects of disaster risk reduction. I hope later I can find much time to touch upon the issues related to enhancing accountability and fostering public awareness.
Thank you very much. Now we've heard from the auditors, we might move over to industry. And we've got Mark Shadidri, the head of disaster risk management with Nestlé. And as I'm sure we're all consumers of their product, it's very important that we know that how they'll look after and keep up our supplies.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real honor to be here and to give you some insights about what Nestlé is doing in this area, and especially how we rely on framework standards to be better prepared for disasters and to adequately manage our risks. Now, Nestlé is a large organization. We are in 150 countries. We have 468 factories around the world. We are working with more than 100,000 suppliers. We have direct contact with 690,000 farmers, but actually we rely on additional 4, 5 or more million farmers to deliver raw materials to us. So we can be well prepared. We can react very quickly, and still we would have big problems in case of disaster if we are not aligned with the local authorities, if we do not align with what our suppliers are preparing, or the farmers, etc. So it's essential for us to be really aligned in this respect. So how do we, or where do we use framework standards? We use them, it starts when we assess the risks. We need to rely on updated and reliable risk maps for example, the natural hazards, to identify those. But then, once we have identified these hazards, we will have to discuss what we need to put in place as prevention measures internally in our sites or along the supply chain. It could be that we need resilience, additional capacity, contingency capacity, or that we are in contact with the suppliers, with the farmers, to ensure that they would still be able to deliver their products to us. Having done that, we will then have to prepare our plans, have business continuity plans, emergency plans ready, available. Again, as I said before, if we do that on our own, we will be floating around in a large area, and that doesn't help. So we need to be aligned with the local authorities, with the suppliers again, to make sure that the infrastructure will be available to bring the raw materials, packaging materials to our sites, and that we again can deliver our products to our customers. So there is a need for a coordinated approach. And then, having done that, we come to I think, the most challenging part, because plans are good, but testing them is much, much better. And that's, I think, the highest challenge we are facing as an organization. Even internally, if we speak about testing, we will have to convince managers to spend resources, to spend time for that. But then, if, again, testing that alone does not ensure a good resilience, we should be testing that with local authorities, with the organizations who would be involved in case of such disaster. And this is where I see the biggest challenge. And actually, if I have one outcome I would like to see as part of this initiative is that this part, the testing of the plans, should also be included somewhere in the framework, right? To ensure that there is that alignment, that coordination within the different stakeholders. So this is in short where we apply, where we use the framework. I had a second question asked about where can we help? And I would just like to raise 3 areas of where we can help, especially during a disaster. Obviously, we have own resources, own infrastructure, for example, trucks, a number of trucks, milk trucks, which can be converted, used to deliver water in the areas. Obviously, we have stocks of food products, of water, which we spend, we prepare, we make disposal of the local authorities, and from there we can also help, if necessary, in the logistics, in the distribution of those products. And then on the prevention side, I already mentioned that in another forum here during the conference. We can also work together with the suppliers and especially the farmers in improving the prevention area. For example, making sure that their wells, their private wells they use for the cattle, but also for the households, are less easily contaminated in case of floods. And we have more than 1,000 employees working exclusively in that area and helping actually the farmers to increase their local resilience in case of major disaster. So these are a few examples on where we could help.
Right, now I'd like to introduce Ms. Mette Lindahl Olsson, who's Head of Natural Hazards and Critical Infrastructure section of the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency. And she's got the interesting predicament of how to work out facilities replacement and that conundrum that I said at the outset of how do you balance how much money you spend on things. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. To raise resilience is our common goal, and it's also seen more and more often in the political agenda. And as mentioned before, we have to work in a coordinated approach. Government and public sector on all levels, as private actors, are working to raise the awareness of risks, sustainability, social responsibility, business continuity, and there are lots of mainstreaming attempts one could adapt, implement, or certify in line with. I just want to mention some international standards that has influenced the work on national level in the field of civil protection, risk assessment, and disaster risk reduction. We have the ISO 9000 on quality management, came 26 years ago. We have ISO 14000 on environmental management systems, which came 17 years ago. And both these standards can be easily integrated into existing operations. ISO 31000 that was mentioned before from 2009 seeks to provide a universal recognized paradigm for practitioners and the companies employing risk management processes to replace the flora of existing standards, methodologies, and paradigms that differed between industries, subject matters, and regions. It also, for example, influenced our Swedish regulations on risk and vulnerability analysis. These risk and vulnerability analyses are compulsory for actors in the crisis management system by law in Sweden. And it has both on municipal, regional and national level, carried out to assess disaster risks, dependencies, societal vital functions that we have to prioritize in the event of disasters, and also capacities in order to take measures to resist and cope with crisis at all levels. Also, we have standards for in the field of European Commission for techniques, equipment, the floods directive with risk maps that enables us to communicate, and that's very important. It enables us also to share knowledge. It enables us to help each other in the event of disasters and crises. Also, we have the EU guidelines on risk assessment that makes us work together. We have a common goal, EU provides guidelines, we can share knowledge and exchange, and this far some countries has reported the national risk assessment to the EU Commission. Sweden has done so too. We're not there yet, but we're working on it. In this context, I also want to mention that Sweden, by the Civil Contingencies Agency, MSB, and my colleague Åsa Kyrk-Geer is chairing the International ISO Standardization Committee on Societal Security, you were mentioned before, since July last year. And it involves a wide range of public and private stakeholders. Several other standards are also under development. These are, for instance, standards on organizational resilience, principles and guidelines for organizational resilience, capacity assessment, and also mass evacuation. And just like the process with Hyogo Framework for Action, which has helped us to create a common global language for disaster resilience, we can see how the development of standards in the wide field of societal security can have a similar benefits in providing shared understanding. So we would like to see Hyogo Framework for Action 2 also referring to common standards, not to invent the wheel again. And next area of ISO standardization, as I mentioned, the societal security, is around organizational resilience, starting up just now, and it's open for there is room for authorities, private sector, and other actors to take actively part. And the standards become as good as we make it. The practitioners are very important. So I would like to encourage more people to actively take part in the standardization and make them really work for us. And the society has all type of actors, and we all share the same systems of dependencies, as was mentioned here. We cannot cope with disasters on our own. New risks are created all the time, with greater complexity in society, including more dependencies and exposure as a result of rapid development. Although my whole perspective or other perspective basis working in the field of disaster risk reduction based on our knowledge and profession are at the center, but we also have to understand others' perspective working in other fields, and this can create a common understanding of a broader overall picture. In this challenging world, governing for societal resilience is something that is researched and worked on, and terms like whole of government and whole of society are used. It is referenced to the society's ability to allocate resources to meet emergencies, disasters, and crises, where it is a great need to prepare and create the best possible prerequisite so that everyone can participate and build resilience in order to lower the consequences and the major costs. And also, international standards is often developed by and used more frequently by the private sector, but also standards are very important for authorities, municipalities, regional and other corporations for a systematic whole of society work, and we have to understand each other. And this could be a benefit of us all. The present and the future challenges aren't something that can be solved by single organizations. We must work together, we must have a common understanding, a common language, and standardization is one way of getting this common understanding agreeable, but also we have to combine it with national guidelines to cope with the standards in accordance with our own legislation, our own culture, our own principles. So by international standards, national guidelines, common understanding, we could reach also so that we can talk to each other over borders, national borders, between companies, to help each other and understand each other and to cope, like the example before with your milk trucks, to use them instead for water distribution in the event of fire, for instance, and so that countries could cope also with equipment for certain reasons, for firefighting, for instance, in forest fires, so that we can ask by the EU mechanism for other countries to help, and we know that equipment would fit. So it's very important for us at all levels of society to cope, to have a common language and understanding. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I would like to endorse that plea for people to become involved with their local standards organisations, because it's only by having the broadest cross-section on national standards development bodies that we're able to get good work done nationally, but it also contributes to getting a broad cross-section of people involved at the ISO level to provide international standards that really are useful and helpful to people in the field. Because there's nothing worse than having people spending a lot of time developing a standard that at the end of the day causes you more problems than it solves. So the only way we can achieve that is by having you people and your colleagues becoming actively involved with national standards bodies, so that, for example, with the Societal Security ISO Technical Committee, it has NSBs that have a wide range of talent represented, and consequently they are bringing that information to the international meeting, so that the documents being produced are going a long way to developing that common language and that common process, because that's really what standardisation is about. And our next speaker, Lorenzo Giacia from the UNECE, this is where they're working very hard to bring a commonality of language and process to the European countries, so that they're looking at risk and regulation across Europe. Thank you, Lorenzo.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you very much to UNISDR for giving us space at this very exciting global platform. I have learned tremendously over the last few days, and I'm very happy to be here. I'd like to say a few words for starters on UNECE itself. We're a bit of a misnomer as our acronym goes, because our membership stretches a lot wider than Europe alone. We engulf also North America, Central Asia, the Balkans, and Turkey, in fact, is one of our members as well. So we have a large membership of 56 countries. And the work we do on standards and technical regulations and regulatory systems stretches even broader and really encompasses global best practice. And indeed, Kevin is acting as the coordinator of one of our initiatives, in fact, the initiative on bringing risk management tools to the regulatory frameworks. For more than 40 years, we have been working and discussing and acting as a forum and developing best practice as regards standards, as regards technical regulations, and also as regards the whole of the technical infrastructure and the institutional capacity that is in place at the national level to ensure that standards are implemented and that regulations are respected. Because, in fact, it may not be so obvious, and it may be worth restating it, that if you don't have a system of measurement, how can you ensure that you have that your standards are implemented, and how do you review over the years your progress in implementing standards. So standards, regulations, and quality infrastructure and the market surveillance authorities that are in place at the local level to ensure that technical regulations are indeed abided to. That's been our mandate for the past 40 years. And then building on this body of knowledge, in 2009, we've started a new area of work. We've started thinking of how technical regulation standards and the whole of the regulatory system, as I have described it, can help in managing risks. And also disaster risks, but thinking broadly of risks of all kinds. We have realized that risk management tools are applied all across areas of regulatory activity. They're applied when you talk about food safety, and they're applied, of course, in health and safety regulations for workers. They're applied in traffic regulations. They're really applied all across the board of regulatory and governmental responsibility. And taken together, this infrastructure, these standards, this technical and institutional background, taken together, this is what really forms and shapes a country's ability also to respond to disasters, and its capacity also to prevent disasters from occurring in the first place. We have also recognized that organizations really deal with risks in the same way throughout the spectrum. And Mark was saying earlier that he was walking us through the different stages of risk management at Nestlé. And you were walking us through in Sweden your experience. And indeed, the steps are really the same wherever you are across the globe and whatever your institution delivers in the end. The steps will always be to identify the risks, to assess the risks, and to decide if and which risk treatment will be appropriate for the risks that you are facing. What we've done in the past 4 years has been to adapt this discourse, to adapt these tools to the reality of regulatory action. We've tried to analyze the regulatory life cycle, starting from when a regulation starts to be developed, starts to be conceived, through to the end when the regulation is out and we need to be sure that we have the means to have it implemented. How can risk management tools really inform all this process? And I think that we now all agree that we need risk management tools in regulatory action. There's no if in this. It's now all across, I think, a shared understanding. What we need at this point is how to. It's not if. So we've produced in UNECE 3 important pieces of work, 3 important guidelines that I have put outside of the room, and I encourage you to pick up a copy as you go out. The first one that is a recommendation to governments on managing risks in regulatory frameworks that guides regulatory authorities in conceiving and implementing regulations using risk management concepts. So we're encouraging authorities to think about the future in a structured way and in a predictable way that really allows for a wide range of consultations with stakeholders and promotes a culture of good governance. The second document is a recommendation on crisis management in regulatory frameworks. And the last is a publication on risk management in regulatory frameworks towards a better management of risks. I was very encouraged to see that in the GAR 2013 this year, we have a whole chapter saying that we need to move from a culture of disaster management to a culture of risk management, and that's really at the heart of our discourse. And when we chose, for example, the picture that you see in the front, this picture really has a message to give, and it is that risks are a dual nature. They are a possible threat, they're also an opportunity. And here we see fire, which is portrayed as a force that destroys. It is also portrayed as an energy that creates. So with this, I'd like to say that if we shift from thinking just of disasters to thinking of risks, we're opening up at a broader level of discussion. We're opening up the discourse to really put the emphasis on the positive and on all the opportunities that we can liberate if we put the right tools into place. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and that does for emphasising the fact that risk is a neutral term. Risk is both opportunity and is threat. It's how we manage risk as to whether we get the benefits. What I'd like to do now is actually open it up to you people to give us your views. Now, we do have a roving microphone, I think, somewhere coming up. And if we start here. Yeah, there's a microphone coming in the front row here.
Hi, my name is Milind Prikar. I'm from Montreal, Canada. A network I run called CANIS. It's an aerospace technology network. We operate almost in over 30 countries, but we are kind of hands-on organization. And the key issue is the data standards. Especially there is a issue of, when the disasters, they have lots of data at the national level, regional level, and the country level. And for example, I was in Vietnam a couple of weeks ago at the UN Spider mission. And the issue was even the departments within the governments would not have, data sharing in terms of the standards issues. And they were looking at organizations who could help us. So basically the UN Spider then came and helped create the legislation, regulatory issue for Vietnam. And I see the same thing in several other countries when, for example, even in Europe and so on. In Latin America, we had the same thing in Chile. So my question is, we had a discussion here 2 days ago, a Science and Technology Forum, and the key finding that we came across was the issue of data sharing. This seems to be the biggest issue or concern at the global level, where the UN ISDR or perhaps maybe your organization should take a lead and role in terms of creating a platform for this, where the countries could have, then the countries come to regional level, and the regional level coming to the beyond the 2015. That's my first question. This is something I think it's a very important issue based on what I have personal hands-on experience. And the second and the most important point, I missed part of your presentation, but accountability. Because I think you raised some interesting points. That report that you raised from, for example, the constellation, disaster constellation for India or other countries. How do you make these regulations or basically enforce, or how do you at least bring those accountability at the government level, where you could at least have some mechanisms to monitor and basically point some kind of pointers, Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. With your first point, I think we have some examples with particular disasters. For example, the tsunami warning systems now in the Pacific and Indian Ocean, where governments have come together, albeit after a terrible disaster, to get that documentation. But perhaps we might get Lorenza to talk about, because that's really what the UNECE work is trying to do, is to get a framework that works on a regional basis, that starts to bring stuff together, and information is certainly vital. So perhaps you might.
Thank you. I'd like to say that the most important recommendation that comes out of our work is really to provide forums for open discussions that will be attracting the private sector, the governmental authorities, and the civil society to talk together about risks and how we evaluate risks and what priority we give to different risks. And in these frameworks, we need to talk about the sharing of information, the sharing of data. We were shown a couple of days ago this new application that allows us to take stock of hundreds of years of risks and events. So we need to, at this point, I think that the data is out there. The key issue is how to use the data to make informed decision, how to create systems of consultations that will make it possible for countries and authorities to be accountable. Thank you.
And then the other one, from the audit and the accountability, because I think that is a vital point, because if we're expecting countries to work together and to contribute, then there must be some way of being able to get that reassurance back.
It's a big issue, but perhaps I could say this. Accountability starts with the awareness of the population of the risks that a country faces and the way these risks are being tackled. That awareness is critical. That means civil society has to be informed. It means members of national parliaments have to be informed. It means journalists have to be informed. It means academics have to be engaged. Audit institutions can play a small role, not bigger than that, but a small but real role in raising that awareness. I'm struck particularly by the need to focus more on the need to invest in prevention and preparedness. The GAR has been quoted by Lorenza as calling for this shift from disaster management, rather relief and rehabilitation, to a greater focus on preparedness and prevention. That is a critical part of awareness raising that needs to happen in societies. It is still not sufficiently understood by policymakers that an ounce of prevention literally is worth a pound of cure. UNDP calculates that every dollar spent on preparing for disasters saves around $7 in economic losses. Many national politicians are unaware of this. Perhaps at the risk of hazarding an overgeneralization, I might say that it appears that some national politicians are more interested in playing a role in disaster relief than in disaster prevention. Because when they engage in disaster relief, it gets them on television, it gets them in the media, it gets them attention and support by the population. Because victims are real people and they want their needs to be taken into account. Disaster prevention seems to be much more abstract and less immediately relevant. So it's a critical task of accountability institutions to focus on this need to invest in preparedness and prevention as a way to save lives and save money.
My name is Pitambar Aryal. I'm from Nepal Red Cross Society. Thanks, panel member, for exciting presentations. Basically, I have two observations. First one is on accountability. Again, what we have seen is that in many cases, like when you say earthquake safety resistant buildings, or many development works, and it has been creating a new risk, like expansion of roads, then who should be blamed? Is it government or construction company or engineers? So somehow there is a involvement of different sectors. So when we talk about accountability, probably we really need to think that aspect as well. And secondly, when we say audit, then are we looking for social aspect of human loss? Like we could see damage and losses, but what about human losses? It's cost being involved. We cannot calculate human loss in money or monetary term. That's why we really see that aspect as well. So in summary, I mean, this could be recommendation that all the DRR practitioners or community should understand what are the regulatory measures or standards. Those standards should be understood in a common manner or all have common understanding. Then probably it will really be effective. Otherwise, in many cases, there are building codes or land use planning, but it hasn't reached to or trickled down up to the community level. So probably this is just a kind of reflection or recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And I think you raised the point about putting dollar costs. If we think in terms of human beings and the loss of life, there is that loss of economic productivity. And I think one of the areas we need to get smarter at is being able to work out what the cost of large-scale death is because of the effect on the economy. And again, if we think in some of the developing countries, in many cases, you lose a wide cross-section of people who mean that you're losing a wide cross-section of skills and eventual resources. And I think perhaps we need to start to become more scientific in coming up with ways of costing the loss of life. We certainly in some countries they've done, for example, with road accidents are concerned, which then gives an economic justification for spending more money on getting rid of dangerous intersections. And it's down to seeing that there is a loss of value, a loss of real economic worth to the country. If we could have...
Okay, merci.
Thank you. Doctor, I would like to tell you what is happening in Niger. It's in Western Africa, and in our country, we have to face a certain number of disasters, mainly pest control and floods. Nationally speaking, a great deal has been done through a very wide mechanism. Many measures, for example, have been taken following floods. For example, the flood that took place last year. And we are now trying to recover from that flood. And we also have a number of implications. We have to have a great deal of political determination. The university has to be involved as well. Now, there is a great deal of involvement by all players, but we have the same problem as everywhere else. That is, that a great deal remains to be done and things don't always function very well. We're very receptive to the norms and standards that have been worked out, and using them in follow-ups. So my question is, how can we have these standards? How can they be made available? And how should we use them in order to develop capacity training and use them on a community level as well? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The standards, you have your national standards organisations, but with respect to ISO standards, again, they're available and distributed through the national standards bodies in the various countries. But for developing countries, there is also a program within ISO that assists in having experts from developing countries to participate on ISO committees in the development of standards. And if we look at that Societal Security Technical Committee that we've mentioned before, that has quite a rigorous program of getting developing nations to its meetings and to get them actively involved in assisting in developing standards and then being able to also bring knowledge and skills back to their particular countries. So I would suggest that a starting point is with your national standards, your member body of ISO, and then with a view to, if they're not already involved in the ISO program for getting people, developing countries involved in standards development, that they do so, because there is a very concerted effort, as I said, within ISO TC 223 to make sure that we get as many developing countries as we possibly can and assist them to attend meetings, to get them involved in giving some of their experiences, but also in enabling them to tap into the wide diversity of experience that is available, so that they can bring that knowledge back to their own country. Here, down the front here.
Thank you. I am David Alexander from University College London. Mr. De Vries, your opening comments were, I think, among the most fundamental, important and lucid of the whole conference, and I congratulate you on that. Followed, I think, also by very fine statements from the rest of the panel. Your focus on accountability, I think, is utterly fundamental, but the fact that, as you say, auditors have been the Cinderellas of this field may explain why so few of them have been sacked, assassinated or imprisoned for their good work. I have nothing but admiration for the Indian government if it is prepared to accept a very critical report. And incidentally, I see nothing in Indian counter-disaster legislation that deals with the plight and protection of the country's 90 million disabled people in disaster. Very important. However, in some countries, other countries, the judiciary may be operated effectively by political puppetry. And in yet other countries, there is a tension between the judiciary and the legislature, usually of a political nature. I wonder whether auditing isn't somewhere within this, whether one actually needs an audit of the audit. But my question is, are you ever afraid that you might, as the teller of truth sometimes does, write a critical report and then meet with an unfortunate accident on the way home?
Well, actually, the thought hasn't occurred to me yet, but you now give me something really important to worry about. Obviously, different countries have different constitutional realities, different political realities, different social and cultural realities, and it means that different audit institutions play different roles. There's no question about that. Some come from an Anglo-Saxon tradition, some come from a much more legalistic tradition, which originates in France. I'm thinking, for example, of the Cour des Comptes across North Africa, even though that tradition is changing. And speaking, quote, truth to power can be unpopular, and it can lead to negative criticism. But it's part, I think, of a wider worldwide movement to improve accountability for government spending in general and for aid, including humanitarian aid, in addition. We need a worldwide joining up of different forces there. For example, one element is an institution called IATI. It is a collaborative venture of governments and of non-governmental organizations that tries to increase financial transparency in terms of aid flows. So I think there are several initiatives that may not lead the responsible people to be immediately targeted physically, but could still play a role. But it's a long haul. And we really need to work, and this is my key point, with organizations of victims and organizations of the local population. It is there that we need to focus our attention. The trend is slowly positive with different situations in different countries. But by and large, I think this consciousness is growing. One example is, to speak just for an audit institution, what's happening in the Philippines, where the Philippine Audit Institution has reached out to local people and has created something called participatory auditing, where actually local citizens are involved in the audit of the official audit institution, which gives the findings of the audit institution more weight when they are published. So not everything's rosy, but I do hope I will not be targeted upon leaving this meeting.
And I would endorse the comments about the Philippines, and that's actually being driven from the president down to understand the risks, and in fact to have audit telling people in authority what they need to hear rather than what they want to hear. And if you will, that's probably the great cultural change that we've got to try and get, is where the politicians and the civic leaders are demanding to be told what they need to hear rather than what they want to hear.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Moahi Beleseng. I come from Botswana. I appreciate the presentations as they have been given to us, but I want to submit that, mostly in developing countries, especially where I come from, sometimes you realize that people do know the standards, or the standards are in place, but when it comes to the actual implementation on the ground, sometimes you find it's a question of priorities. We have had instances where a bridge was built and that bridge later on collapsed during floods season, mainly because, not because the standards were not there when the bridge was built. You would find that the engineers would tell you it was a question of priorities at the time of developing this particular bridge. We had the standards, we had the data in place, we knew that the water levels would sometime rise, let's say as an example, to 5 meters, but the bridge was deliberately built at 3.5 meters, which means sometimes it's an issue of resources that are there in place. So therefore, you may find that it differs from country to country, and depending on the resources that are available, you may find that even if the standards are there or the audit has been done or the implementation of the project has been done properly, you will always have those discrepancies. So my challenge as a coordinating office in terms of risk management is how do you then balance these? How do you then convince the sectors that deal with say infrastructure as an example to always take into consideration these issues of risk management during the development process? Thank you.
Yes, maybe one have to start from the beginning. In this room, we see some equipment that have been through standardization process that we all understand. For instance, the escape route signs and the fire extinguishers and things like that. Maybe that is to start to build awareness, but the understanding of fulfilling the standards means is maybe a higher understanding, and that's not just technical, or if you have the skills to understand that, that's more like a culture and take responsibility for the decisions, I think. So maybe it's a learning process. We're having it all the time, and it's hard to answer.
Maybe. If I may just add one comment, I think it really starts with creating the transparency. If the higher the transparency, the quicker there will be a need or there will be a wish to improve a situation. At least that's my experience in the private company, in the private sector. Without any mandate, actually. You show the situation and the people, they do want to improve the situation. But if you don't know, you can't.
And you will always have the problem that there is only a limited amount of funds. And again, if I think in some of the cases in Australia where the bridges have been built to correct standards, but they haven't had the extra money to make it 2 or 3 metres higher. So yes, you get another bigger flood comes through and you lose that bridge all over again. So it's, in some cases, it's not a matter of building to standards. You still actually do that. But it's, have you got the extra funds to build the bridge that little bit higher, that little bit stronger? And that's really the argument that needs to be had, It's not about do we build to standards. I believe we should be building to standards, but from a resilience perspective of how do we get the extra funding to make it that little bit higher, that little bit stronger.
Microphone, please.
I wanted, from my experience in auditing business continuity within the private sector and governments, one of the key issues which always comes up is accountability, and it's sitting in low management. So when we do a business continuity audit, we often find facilities are taking these huge risks of the company and organisation, and we're campaigning to make business continuity a board issue. And when we think about disaster risk reduction, of course, this has got to be accounted by the board. And again, we're not seeing this accountability by board members. And I fear that we need to take count of that, because it is vital to have good business continuity plans, good resilience in place. You have to have board involvement. Thank you.
Hola, mi nombre es Susana Fuentes.
My name is Susana Fuentes. I come from Chile. I don't speak English or French. I only speak Spanish. Can you hear me? Yes. My name is Susana Fuentes. I'm in the private sector, and I deal with risk, prevention, and business. Everything that happened the 26th of February and with the earthquake, well, there wasn't much information about this, and the businessmen in my country never came to help because they didn't know about it. There was very little information. They didn't know about this particular conference, and I'm sorry they didn't come to this conference. So we're working in every area in Chile, in the banking area and other areas as well. In this 2010, all the communications sectors were involved with the earthquake. I saw that there were 31,000 people. I saw that there were a number of standards of ISO 31000 and other ISO standards that are involved, and I'm trying to ask what is the right standard that should be used. I'm not really sure which one is the right one. If somebody asks me in Chile at some point, I won't know what to say. So this is my question. Perhaps one of you could go to Chile, because we're doing a great deal. We have a lot of events, and many of them may interest you. We have something in the Andes, and people don't often come, but we would like them to come and to train us. People only go to events when they hear about them, but our governments don't hear about it and don't inform people either. So there's a lack of information. And I'd like to hear about these standards, get more information about them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For a starter, with standard, there is no one standard. 31,000, ISO 31,000 deals with risk management, or the management of risk. There are a series of ISO 22300 series that deal also with societal security, management of disasters, business continuity. So it's the 31,000 series and the 22,300 series of ISO standards. In the case of 31,000, that has in fact been adopted as a Chilean national standard. So that's possibly one of the starting points, is a standard that has been adopted as a national standard within Chile. But how you go about getting people involved, it does come back to how government communicates to the people, how it communicates to business and to industry. Ms. Cosco has just recently been in Chile, actually at a conference, dealing with some of these matters. So it isn't that they're not happening in Chile, but the problem, of course, is how they get the publicity. And that is always a major problem for anybody who organises conferences, is how do I tap into the people who need to actually know? And it's like we need to have auditing where they're telling management what they need to hear. Well, we as conference organisers need to somehow be able to get our message to the people who need to come and participate in these sorts of conferences. It is a very difficult exercise, but I'm quite sure that through the UN there are ways of organising for speakers to come to Chile, the same through ISO, which is based here in their central secretariat here in Geneva. The auditors, again, as we know, the auditors are very keen on spreading their message. So I think that would be my starting point, would be to have a look at, talk to your national standards body to see what standards, or what international standards they have adopted as Chilean national standards, with a view to starting them as the way to get the process going. I'm conscious we're running out of time and we still have a number of hands up, but we might run the risk of incurring the wrath of my rapporteur by running over time.
Franklin MacDonald from Jamaican York University. Based on the GAR report which we have before us in this meeting, one of the areas of weakness of the HFA to 2015, which needs to be addressed in HFA beyond 2015, HFA 2, would appear to be things like regulatory and standard enforcing, which have a chance of driving down the risk, addressing the issue of risk drivers. But from the comments of my colleague from Niger and some of the other comments and my own observation in the Caribbean, the national standards organizations, the focal points for disaster risk reduction, and possibly the national bodies dealing with audit would need to come together in a new configuration to bring on board the sorts of measures which we've discussed here. This is a tactical issue, but it does seem to me that going forward, some sort of specific technical assistance program may be needed to, in fact, facilitate the modernization and progressive improvement of the regulatory framework and the application of these standards. So I wondered if there could be a comment, or if there's any way that could be considered as something which would go forward to address what is really one of the I would say glaring weaknesses of HFA 1.
I would think that your comments will be noted by the rapporteur with a view to bringing that to the plenary sessions to get it onto the agenda for 2015, because you're quite right. It's one thing to produce standards and regulations, but it's how do we get an understanding across borders. Now, okay, we're doing it well within Europe, but it's how do we get to some of the developing countries? And it's no good saying, well, you could always pick up the book and read it. It's a case of how do we get people into a venue where they can workshop their way through it to develop a common process, not just for their country, but for their region. And I think that's a vital part of this whole program, and I would suggest that is something that would be taken up and I would see as being a product of this meeting. Now we'll have one there and then you. You have the chance of having the last say.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was a bit scared whether I would say something before we run out of time. Yeah, My name is Yafet Itenge from Namibia, and I had just one observation to make to the on the auditor report, which Namibia was reflected, which is good, and we really appreciate for that one. But I just want to find out how recent is that finding or whatever. Maybe we'll talk more about that one. It's just an invitation that we may have one-to-one, so that before I lose you or I miss you. Then the other one is how can then we convey, because the whole idea about this conference, how to reach the people there. Now that we are talking about these standards, which are somewhere adopted, designed, being implemented, accepted in some areas, in some countries, but still there are countries who have not yet agreed or probably seen it or accepted to this one. Yesterday, I made a remark focusing still on the UN. I think I'm going to repeat this one, making my call again that it's good to hear this one from different UN agencies, but still I am of the opinion that UN should do more to address some of these issues jointly, so that it will not be only a UNESCO thing, it will not be only a UN ESE or UN ISDR issue. We should really move together. It is not only an issue of national or regional working together. I think we have really to move together, because my concern here is much of these disasters, when they are coming, when they hit our countries, they destroy infrastructures because of many reasons, poorly designed, and so on. The question is, do they meet standards? I am a disaster management coordinator, but I might also have weaknesses to coordinate all these sectors because some of these things are too technical. By calling the UN to do more on coordination of these efforts, I would like also to see the UN reaching our education institutions. Probably there's a session on the science and technology and so on. I hope this information is being filtered down. This is all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I'm quite sure that that's given the rapporteur some interesting data to put into his report, because you're quite right. Like all large organisations, the UN is starting to develop into silos, and there is that need to bring the resources together to provide that assistance. And I think that's something that needs to be debated within the UN, and it's certainly something that I think would suggest needs to be put on the agenda for the 2015 conference, to look at how can we work together within the UN to provide the assistance that countries need. And now, sir, you.
Buenos días, mi nombre es Raúl Bustos.
Hello, my name is Raúl Bustos.
Provengo de Chile.
I also come from Chile, and
Bomberos de Chile.
I am a
También
member
grupos de
of
respuesta
Chilean
que
fire
lamentablemente
people.
ingresan a los edificios cuando no han
We
cumplido las normas.
obviously go into buildings when they haven't complied with the
rescatar
standards, and of course have to deal with
Mi pregunta directa es
that in
para
order
la
to
señora
rescue
Coscun
people.
en cuanto,
My
refiero a la
direct
norma
question is to Ms. Coscun.
5510, en que
Standard
me ha
inquietado,
me ha causado curiosidad de cómo esa norma fue cambiando a un
exactly
amplio,
how the
a un campo
standard
más amplio en
was
cuanto a
broadened
introducir lo del marco de acción de yogo, esa
When
norma
we introduced the
es
HFA,
nacional,
the
o es
HIGO
una
framework for
norma
action, is it a
internacional?
national
Primero,
standard or an
disculpando mi
international
ignorancia.
standard?
Y segundo, me
I'm
interesa
sorry for
cómo
my
eso fue,
ignorance,
cómo
and
esa norma
also
fue cambiando
I'm
a
interested
introducir
as to
un
how
marco
the
más
standard
amplio.
was
Esa
changed in order to
básicamente la pregunta y un
introduce
perfil
a broader
breve
sphere
de la
of
norma.
coverage. And I just wondered if you could give a very quick overview of the standard in question.
Thank you for your question. Actually, I mentioned to broaden the not standards, accountability framework. I mentioned that. Actually, the current accountability framework covers the accountability of the government, bureaucracy, politicians, to the public and to parliaments. In this frame, participation of Parliament, particularly citizens, to this process remains limited. The participation and contribution for ensuring accountability for Parliament and citizens needs knowledge, needs information. And actually, like disaster risk reduction and climate change, such as these issues, it's very important accountability. In the current accountability framework, international community and citizens do not involved. I mentioned just only accountability framework, not standards.
Right. Now, thank you. I'm conscious that we are running over time, but quickly through the panel, what one action do you believe is required in the context of the next international framework for disaster risk reduction? In other words, what needs to be dealt with at the 2015?
So I really think that the framework standard should help to raise awareness, transparency, and do not forget that the private sector can really help during, after a crisis, and this should be tested before, this should be planned before, and therefore it needs to be part of the standard somewhere.
Yes, my suggestion is to actually refer to standards, that it's there, that standards could be used, not to invent the wheel, but to cope with the standardization organizations, so that standards not stand alone and HFA not stand alone, but to use business continuity standards, risk management standards, so that we could also cope with private sector that already have implemented those standards, and also it's easier to have sets of common indicators for the HFA success through using parts of standards, I think.
Thank you. Echoing slightly differently the point made by Nestle, the current Hugo framework is primarily directed at governments. That remains absolutely necessary. That's indispensable, and it must be the key priority. But I hope that in the new version, more attention will be paid to the partners of government. And the partners of government include the private sector, but they also include the parliaments, civil society organizations, and institutions such as the watchdogs of the public, that auditors are, to create greater accountability and create a more holistic perspective on disaster risk management. So keep the focus on government, but pay more attention to the partners and strengthen the accountability dimension.
I can say that I agree with Mr. De Vries, and I can add maybe the accountability framework should be broadened and redrawn at local, national, and international level, taking into account the global issues in coming future. A new accountability frame specified with a broad perspective should be reflected in the national legislation and arrangements and international agreements in the upcoming years. The audit mission of SAIS for global issues, again, such as disaster risk reduction and climate change, should be interpreted and reconsidered and broadened from the perspective of enhancing the accountability. Thank you.
My plea is to have a whole of government and a whole of country mechanism to assess risks and to channel this broad perspective back to the central government. What you were saying about the bridge is a very telling example. We do not have resources to attain absolute safety. Absolute safety cannot be a goal. We have to work with finite resources. But then we need to decide where these resources need to be spent. If they're going to be spent in one area, they will not be available in another. However, these choices need to be made in a rational and in a participatory manner, and not in an haphazard manner without leaving the people exposed, without telling them that they are. And this is really a shortcutting of the issue. We have to be open and transparent, and we have to decide where to place resources in a way that is accountable for the taxpayer at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I suppose the two things that have come out today that I'd like to put on the wish list for 2015 is the very valid point made by one of our participants, and that is that the UN starts to coordinate approaches so that they do provide comprehensive training packages and information to countries, and that to assist them in the development of how they deal with natural disasters, rather than having the UNHCR coming in to sort out the problems afterwards. It would be great if they could get their act together. The other thing that I think has also come out very much today is the need for good governance in how risk and disasters are managed. But also, if we're going to have good governance and understand risk, then we need to make sure that we do have proper assurance programs that provide the background and the reports to show that policies are in place, but more importantly, that they are being implemented and the information being provided through those programs and policies back to management has rigour and accuracy. One of the interesting things in putting together sessions such as this, which rely very much on you, the participants, is to see whether we'll end up going home early because nobody's got any questions. The fact that we've actually managed to run 15 minutes over time is, I suggest, an indication of some very real interest, and hopefully we've managed to address some of those questions, and most importantly, get them onto the agenda for further consideration and action within the 2015 conference. So thank you very much to the panellists for your involvement, but most especially a thank you to you, the participants, who have actually given us such interesting background. Thank you all very much.